Hello, everyone. Most life resets don't always begin with some sort of dramatic collapse. And what I found is that many of the things that we experience in the current present reality of our lives often starts and commences with small decisions, overlooked warning signs, shifting priorities, and changing relationships that eventually lead to a moment that can change everything that you know about your life moving forward. So, in this episode, we're going to explore why disruption is a normal part of life and why so many people feel unprepared when it arrives, and how transformational resilience is built by deciding what comes next. So, with that, I just want to welcome everyone back to another episode of The Next Baseline. I'm your podcast host, Danny DeJesus, and this podcast, as always, is about life resets and what it takes to reach the next baseline. So, whether that life disruption comes through divorce, co parenting challenges, professional pressure, career transitions, health struggles, financial setbacks, or a personal wake up call, the question is no longer how to get your old life back, but rather the question now becomes, what do you build now moving forward? So if you find value in these conversations, the links to the Elevatus entire ecosystem is going to be in the description below. So with that, let's get started on today's topic of discussion. And here's the thing. Life can quickly change overnight. And at least that's how I think it tends to feel when you're standing in the thick and in the middle of change, transition, and disruption. Because you see, one day you're living in what may feel like a normal life. You have your routines, you have your plans, you may have expectations about where things are potentially heading. And then suddenly, like at the snap of a finger, something happens that changes the direction that you once thought was going in a specific way. Now everything has changed literally overnight. And that could be as a result of a relationship ending. Maybe there's a career change, or maybe the career fell apart, something fell through professionally. A health issue now changes a lot of different things. So think of things like cancer, an organ failure. Maybe it's also the loss and functionality of a limb, for example. Also, family conflict, that all of a sudden what you thought was functional is no longer functional within the family. Maybe it's your child that's struggling. Maybe from a parental standpoint, you're struggling with how to navigate life with your child, especially as they grow older into those teenage years. Maybe there's some estrangement that's happening, or maybe there's no contact for whatever the reasons are. Another factor could be a financial setback. And when you put these things together, it can feel like the entire world shifted in just a single moment. But really, when you look back at any and all of these different types of situations, and again, we're not just limited to what I listed out there, but when you look back, I think we can often discover that the moment that we experience collapse for the first time didn't actually start overnight. In fact, it started weeks, months, years earlier. And there were small decisions that were made, small compromises, small patterns, small conversations. There were small warning signs that were present that led up to that collapsible moment. And each one, as time has progressed and gone by, each one of those things may have seemed very insignificant by itself at the time that we've seen them. And unfortunately, hindsight is always 2020. And then what happens is, as time progresses and those small things become bigger things, and all of a sudden it starts to snowball, then one day all of those parts and pieces, they come together and they create a pivotal moment for our lives. They create a turning point. And so I like to think about this moment like like a movie. So when you watch a film, I think the audience typically remembers the big moments in cinema. I think we can remember the breakup, the failure, the betrayal, the crisis, and then also the victory. And every main character has a backstory. And there were experiences shaping them long before we, the audience, for that film, actually meet them. And there were decisions leading them toward that very moment, whether again it was maybe a breakup, failure, a betrayal, crisis, victory. Similar to a movie, similar to the characters and the protagonists in a movie, our lives are oftentimes very, very similar because here's the thing: we are the main character within each of our stories, and every chapter of our life is preparing us for the next one. So, whether we realize it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not. And one lesson I learned through whether it was through divorce, because I've been through a couple divorces already, co parenting challenges. Lord knows I have been through over a decade's worth of co parenting challenges and continue to go through co parenting challenges today. My active duty military career, so through military service, various leadership roles I've been in, and then also the lessons of building Elevatus coaching and what I've learned through all of that is that disruption is really not the exception. Disruption and life transition is really just another part of life. And I think most people spend a lot of energy trying to avoid disruption, trying to avoid pain and discomfort. And the truth is that we can't, because eventually something happens or something will happen in each and every one of our lives. It's almost promised. If you live on planet Earth, something is going to happen, and there's going to be a moment where we're going to have to confront that reality. And it could be that relationship is no longer working. And here's the thing, guys. I'm not just talking guys and gals, I should say. And here's the thing. Relationships are not just romantic. They could be friendship, they can be professional, they could be with our children, our spouses, and the list can go on. But the point is that there's going to be a time where a relationship that we thought we valued is no longer going to be working. That career is no longer going to fit who we are in a particular moment in time. The lifestyle, because sometimes there's a thing called lifestyle creep, sometimes it's not going to be sustainable. And then also the identity that we have built for ourselves, the identity that we have been carrying is also potentially no longer going to reflect the person that we're becoming or trying to become. And I think this is a phase of life where people sometimes get stuck in. And not because disruption and a life transition is taking place or that's happening, but rather because people often try to keep and rebuild on something that is no longer in existence. A lot of times we have trouble as human beings to recognize or to even accept something new has to be transitioned into. And we keep trying to return back to an old version of whatever the life that we had. And that, it could be, when I think of an old version, it could be an old version of ourselves. It could be an old reality that doesn't exist today. And then that the problem is that life is going to keep moving. It's going to keep moving forward, whether we're ready for it or not. And here's the thing: people are going to come and go. Jobs are going to change. Children are going to grow up. Friendships are going to evolve. Communities that we're into are going to change and they're going to shift over time. Family dynamics always tend to change. I know after the passing of my father back back in 2019, there was a lot of change that came with that from a family perspective. Even myself, I've probably lost contact. Not that lost contact, but I haven't really been fully engaged with my extended family since the passing of my father. And here we are in 2026. Sometimes our priorities, they're going to change. And here's the thing, nothing stays static, nothing stays frozen in any given timeline. But yet, many of us, we spend, I think, years trying to preserve something that was only really meant for a specific season of life. I think one reason this is so difficult is because the messages that I think we constantly receive, whether that's through the communities that we're a part, maybe friends. Sometimes we search for those cognitive biases that reinforce our opinion. We see a lot of this online, especially online, and much of modern culture, especially here in the United States. Much of our culture, we tend to focus on ourselves, our success, our happiness, our goals, our personal image, our personal brand. But very little attention, I think, is often given to actually preserving relationships, preserving community, shared responsibility, and long term connection. And that is those elements right there. The ones that I just mentioned, relationships, communities, shared responsibility, long term connection, that is very counterintuitive to modern day culture, I think. And I think that's something that it's time that we need to really start to take a look at even more. In fact, when we look at the curated lives of people on social media, I think we tend to forget that we see carefully curated and edited snapshots of people's everyday lives, or what we think is everyday life. We see outcomes, and we rarely see the struggles that actually produce them. We see the highlight reels. I think, rarely see the sacrifices, but we see the success. And when we look at all of that, I think we rarely see the collapse that came before it. Because here's the thing: for every success that I think we see in life, or the success that we see other people experience, I'm a believer that there was a collapsible moment somewhere in there. And I think we live in a society, in a modern day world, where it's a lot of instant gratification. And unfortunately, as I mentioned or alluded to, social media is not helping with any of that. And so I think, me personally, I even think social media, it's time that it goes through some reform. But anyways, that's a whole nother topic for another whole nother podcast episode. So I digress from that opinion I just made. But here's here's the thing. When it comes down to collapse, this idea of collapse, which, by the way, is the first step, or is the first phase of C2R2E: collapse, confrontation, realignment, reclamation, elevation. It's a framework for life transition here. So when we think about collapse, I think many people tend to feel blindsided when the hardship or that collapsible moment arrives. And they often think that they're the only one struggling. And the reality is, there's many people struggling with the same thing, because life transitions are universal. Regardless of where we are in the world, life transitions are everywhere, and no one's safe from it. Yeah, the details may change. The outer shell may just take a different shape, may look something different. But the experience of life transition and collapse, that's pretty static. That's pretty consistent. And at some point, almost everyone will face a season where they have to really ask a difficult question. And that is, what do they build forward now? Not how they get their old life back, not how do they make everything go back to normal, not how to avoid the feeling of being uncomfortable or feeling uncomfortable, but rather, what do you build now based on what life has revealed through a collapse, through a collapsible moment. And for me, this is where I think transformational resilience begins. Not with not with motivation or inspiration, not with positive thinking, not with pretending everything it's okay, but it begins with a moment of acceptance. Accepting that something has changed, something is going to be undergoing transition. Accepting that a chapter of life has ended and concluded, and that it is now time to accept that a new reality is about to be birthed or about to come into existence, and then making a decision to move forward anyway. And so, and this is one of the main reasons I created the C2R2E framework, what I call a life transition framework. And again, it's collapse, confrontation, realignment, reclamation, and elevation. Because every meaningful transformation that I've ever experienced follows those stages. First, what we typically see is something falls apart, then you're forced to confront with honest truth the current reality. Then you go through a process of realigning your life around what is true. Then you begin after that reclaiming your personal agency, your voice, the ability to actually begin to make change. And then eventually you get to this place of elevation where you eventually reach a new baseline. Not an old life, but a new one. Hopefully a stronger one, a more intentional one. And that's an important distinction because the goal from this point on is never really to go backward. In fact, you can't, because the past is the past, but rather the goal is to use the present reality to build a new future, to build forward. The old version of life is probably never going to return, but that doesn't mean that your future is gone. It simply means that your next chapter is waiting to be written. So with that, every episode I love concluding with a reflective exercise for you to do and just for you to think about. And so this is what I got. What I want to give to you is this. Take 10 minutes. Take 10 minutes this week and ask yourself one question. What am I still holding onto that no longer fits the season of life I'm in today? And I want you to write your answer down. Just be very honest with you. Take a few minutes. I'm asking only for 10 minutes of your time. I'm asking you to do a self-reflection exercise here. And again, ask yourself, what are you trying to hold on to that no longer fits the current season of life that you're in today? And then I have one more question to ask you after you answer that. And if you need to, just pause this episode right where we're at. Take a few minutes to answer that. Once you fully answered that question, here's the second question I have. If you were to stop trying to recreate the past, what would you start building instead? And I don't want you to worry about building the entire future, but what I want you to do is just identify that next step, because that's enough. And this is one action just to get you to think, but with the implication that is going to have a profound effect on what you do next. So with that, here's your overall key takeaway for this episode before we conclude. Life-changing moments rarely happen in isolation. They are usually the result of many small events that eventually lead to a turning point, a pivotal moment, a moment that I call a collapsible moment. And transformational resilience begins when you stop trying to return to the life that you lost, the life that you no longer have, but rather you start building that same life. You start finding you start finding and exploring what you need to build to move forward for a future that has yet to be written. And that's the beautiful thing about life. We can all experience a collapsible moment, regardless of what it is, except the fact that we are no longer going to be living the same way that we were. We can honor the life that we did have. We can grieve, in fact, the life that we did have. And then we can say to ourselves, hey, what do I need to do to now move forward? What do I build moving forward? So, with that, if this podcast episode spoke to you and you resonated with it, and you know someone else out there that is struggling and can benefit, I'm going to ask that you share this episode with them, because you never know. You never know what someone is going through, and how a message like this can be just the encouragement that they need. So, with that, I am going to wish you peace, love, joy, and all the happiness in the world. And just know that regardless of what you're going through, there's hope for you, and that there's a process to reaching a next baseline for yourself. But it's going to take work, and it's just going to start, just like in the reflective exercise. It just starts by a couple of very simple, basic questions. What is no longer working for you? And after you accept that, what do you then build to move forward? So with that, I am Danny DeJesus. Thank you so much for sticking with me on this episode of The Next Baseline, and I will catch you next time on the next episode. All right, take care.